America had no permanent income tax until 1913. Here is the exact date. It changed. And what else happened that same year? I want to show you 3 dates. February 25th, 1862, the Legal Tender Act. The United States government prints its own money without banks for the first time in American history. February 25th, 1863, the National Currency Act. Congress builds the replacement system that puts banks back in the middle of money creation. Exactly 1 year later. The same date, February 25th, 1913. The 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution is certified by the Secretary of State. The federal government gains the permanent legal authority to tax the income of every American citizen. Same date, 51 years later. 10 months after that certification, on December 23, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signs the Federal Reserve Act. The Central Bank of the United States is created the same year. 3 of the most consequential financial laws in American history share the same February 25th date across a span of 51 years. One of them was passed the same year as the institution that would use the tax revenue the others authorized. I am not telling you what to conclude from this. I am showing you the sequence and asking you to sit with it. The physical object that anchors this story does not fit in a drawer. It is the United States Constitution itself, specifically the document that the National Archives holds, certifying that 3/4 of the state legislatures had ratified the 16th Amendment. That document was certified on February 3rd, 1913. The Secretary of State declared it in effect on February 25th, 1913. Before that date, the federal government had no permanent authority to tax your income. After it, the authority was written into the Constitution in language that no Congress could repeal with a simple majority, and no president could veto into non-existence. The question of what changed in 1913, who drove those changes, and why 2 of the most significant expansions of federal financial power in American history happened in the same 12 months is a question the official version of American history tends to treat as coincidence. I want to show you why the people involved did not treat it as coincidence at all. What America looked like before 1913. To understand what the 16th Amendment changed, you need to understand how the federal government paid its bills before it existed. For most of American history, the federal government ran on tariffs and excise taxes. Tariffs were taxes on imported goods. When you bought foreign cloth or foreign steel or foreign sugar, a portion of the price went to the federal government. Excise taxes were levied on specific domestic goods, most notably alcohol and tobacco. This system had real consequences for who paid and who did not. Tariffs made imported goods more expensive, which effectively taxed consumers, particularly working-class consumers who spent a higher proportion of their income on goods. Meanwhile, the wealthiest Americans, whose income came primarily from financial instruments, from dividends, from returns on capital, paid no federal tax on that income whatsoever. A factory worker paid tariff-inflated prices on everything he bought. The man who owned the factory paid nothing on the profits it generated. This was not an accident. It was a design. And it was a design that had been explicitly challenged by the populist and progressive movements for decades before 1913. The farmers of the greenback movement, The same men who had fought for the preservation of government-issued currency in the 1870s and 1880s had also argued for an income tax. They understood that the tariff system transferred wealth upward systematically. The Populist Party platform of 1892 explicitly called for a graduated income tax. William Jennings Bryan, whose Cross of Gold speech had been the last great electoral battle over monetary policy, had also championed the income tax. Congress had actually tried to impose an income tax in 1894. The Revenue Act of that year levied a 2% tax on incomes above $4,000. The Supreme Court struck it down the following year in Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Company, ruling that a direct tax on income was unconstitutional without apportionment among the states based on population. The decision effectively made a federal income tax impossible under the existing constitutional framework. The wealthy had used the courts to protect themselves from taxation. For 18 years, from 1895 to 1913, the legal barrier held. Then something unexpected happened, the amendment that was supposed to fail. In 1909, the Senate was debating a tariff bill. A group of progressive senators, frustrated with the tariff system's structural bias toward wealth, proposed adding an income tax provision. The dominant Republican establishment opposed it, but they faced a political problem. If they voted against the income tax openly, they would hand the Democrats a powerful campaign issue. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, the same man who 3 years later would secretly draft the framework for the Federal Reserve System on Jekyll Island, came up with what he believed was a clever solution. He proposed a constitutional amendment authorizing an income tax. Amendments required ratification by 3/4 of the states. Aldrich believed and convinced his allies that the states would never ratify such an amendment. The rural western and southern states might support it, but the northeastern industrial states, whose wealthy citizens and corporations would pay the most, would block ratification. The amendment would fail, the political pressure would be relieved, and the tariff system would survive. Aldrich was wrong. Between 1909 and 1913, the political landscape of the country shifted faster than the Eastern establishment had anticipated. State after state ratified the 16th Amendment. The rural and agricultural states that supported it were joined by states that the establishment had expected to hold. The economic pressures of the period, rising prices, growing inequality, the political energy of the progressive movement proved stronger than the resistance of northeastern industrial interests. On February 3, 1913, the 36th state ratified the amendment. 3/4 of the states had spoken. The 16th Amendment was part of the Constitution. On February 25, 1913, Secretary of State Philander Knox officially proclaimed it ratified and in effect. The federal government now had the permanent constitutional authority to tax income without apportionment. The conservatives, who had proposed the amendment expecting it to fail, had handed their opponents the most powerful financial tool in American political history. They had done it deliberately as a political maneuver, and they had miscalculated completely. The Revenue Act of 1913, passed later that same year, implemented the first permanent income tax. In its initial form, it was modest almost to the point of irrelevance. Less than 1% of the population was subject to it. The rate on income above $3,000 was 1%. The highest rate, on incomes above $500,000 was 7%. And the tax was designed to demonstrate constitutional validity, not to generate significant revenue. But the constitutional validity was now established. The structure was in place. Future Congresses could expand rates and lower thresholds as political conditions allowed, and they did. By the time of World War I, the top rate was 77%. The tool that had been created as a 1% demonstration had become the primary mechanism of federal finance, the secret meeting that designed the other half. 10 months after the income tax amendment was certified, a different group of men were working on a different problem. But the problems were connected, and some of the same people were involved. November 1910. 3 years before the Federal Reserve Act would be signed, 6 men gathered secretly at the Jekyll Island Club off the coast of Georgia. The club was described by Munsey's magazine in 1904 as the richest, the most exclusive, the most inaccessible club in the world. The 6 men were Senator Nelson Aldrich, the same man who had proposed the income tax amendment expecting it to fail. A. Piatt Andrew, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan. Arthur Shelton, Aldrich's private secretary. Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York. And Paul Warburg, a partner at the banking house of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Aldrich knew that their connections to Wall Street would create political problems if the meeting became known, so he went to considerable lengths to conceal it. He instructed the men to travel separately to a railway station in New Jersey, coming one at a time so as not to attract attention. Once aboard his private train car, he told them to use only first names: Nelson, Henry, Frank, Paul, Piatt, Arthur. The staff would not learn their identities, and the meeting's purpose would remain concealed. They told people they were going duck hunting. Frank Vanderlip described the scene in his autobiography published in 1935, more than 2 decades later. He wrote that despite his views about the value of greater publicity for corporate affairs, there was an occasion near the close of 1910 when he was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. They spent 10 days on Jekyll Island drafting a plan to reform the nation's banking system. The plan that emerged, which came to be called the Aldrich Plan, proposed a centralized reserve system that would stabilize the currency, act as a lender of last resort during panics, and provide the elastic currency that the national banking system created in 1863 had failed to provide. Paul Warburg, who directed most of the drafting, wrote afterward that the matter of a uniform discount rate was discussed and settled at Jekyll Island. The meeting and its purpose remained a closely guarded secret. The participants denied it had occurred. It was not until the 1930s, when Aldrich's biography was published and Vanderlip wrote about it in the Saturday Evening Post, that the full story became publicly known. The panic that made it possible to understand why the Federal Reserve was created. You need to understand the financial panic of 1907. Because that panic was the direct cause. In October of 1907, the Knickerbocker Trust Company of New York collapsed. Depositors lined up to withdraw funds. The panic spread to other institutions. The Trust Company of America and the Lincoln Trust Company faced runs. Banks across the country tightened credit. The stock market collapsed. The federal government had no mechanism to respond. There was no central bank. There was no lender of last resort. The only entity with the resources and the relationships to stabilize the system was J.P. Morgan himself, the most powerful private banker in America. Morgan convened a series of emergency meetings in his private library at his Manhattan home. He organized an infusion of capital into threatened institutions, pressured other bankers to contribute, and essentially performed the function of a central bank through personal authority and personal wealth. The panic was contained. The system did not collapse. But the episode revealed something about American finance that could not be ignored. The stability of the entire financial system of the world's largest economy depended on the judgment and willingness of one private citizen. If Morgan had been unavailable or unwilling or simply wrong in his assessment, the outcome could have been catastrophic. Nelson Aldrich, the chair of the Senate Finance Committee and one of the most powerful Republicans in Congress, recognized that something had to change. He sponsored legislation creating the National Monetary Commission to study the problem and propose solutions. Then he went to Europe to study central banking systems. And then, in November of 1910, he went to Jekyll Island. The Aldrich plan that emerged from Jekyll Island was presented to the National Monetary Commission in early 1911. It faced immediate political opposition. The plan proposed a National Reserve Association governed primarily by the banking industry itself. Critics, particularly progressive Democrats, argued that this was simply a mechanism to give private bankers formal control over the nation's money supply. The plan was defeated in Congress, but the problem it was designed to solve had not gone away, and in 1912, the political landscape changed again. Woodrow Wilson won the presidency in 1912 in a three-way race fractured by Theodore Roosevelt's independent candidacy. The Democrats gained control of both chambers of Congress. The Aldrich plan was dead, but banking reform was not. As Carter Glass of Virginia in the House and Robert Owen of Oklahoma in the Senate drafted the legislation that would become the Federal Reserve Act. Their bill incorporated the essential structural features of the Jekyll Island proposal while giving it a form that progressive Democrats could accept. Instead of a single National Reserve Association controlled by private banks, there would be 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, with a Federal Reserve Board appointed by the President providing some degree of governmental oversight. The bill was debated through most of 1913. When all Senate Republicans voted for a substitute measure, Senate Democrats invoked their binding caucus rule, making the bill a party question. On December 23, 1913, 3 days before Christmas, the Senate passed the Federal Reserve Act. Woodrow Wilson signed it into law that same evening. The system that Paul Warburg had designed on Jekyll Island, the system that Frank Vanderlip had described himself as being furtive and secretive about, had become the law of the United States, in a form modified enough to pass Congress, but containing what Vanderlip himself would write was the essential substance of the original plan. What 1913 built the Federal Reserve System as created in 1913 was a compromise between the private banking industry's desire for a central bank it controlled and the progressive movement's demand for a central bank the government controlled. Neither side got exactly what it wanted. Both sides got something. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks were nominally private institutions owned by their member banks, governed by boards of directors elected partly by member banks. The Federal Reserve Board in Washington was appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. The system sat in the boundary between public and private in a way that made it genuinely difficult to categorize. This ambiguity was not an accident. It was a design feature. The men who wrote the legislation understood that a purely private central bank would face unacceptable political opposition. A purely governmental central bank would face opposition from the banking industry. The hybrid structure gave each side something it could defend while giving neither side everything it wanted. What the Federal Reserve received was the power to set the discount rate, which influenced interest rates throughout the economy. The power to act as a lender of last resort for member banks, the power to regulate the money supply, and the power to purchase government securities in the open market, which would eventually become the primary tool of monetary policy. What the income tax provided was the revenue base that made expanded federal operations possible. Before the income tax, the federal government was constrained by what tariffs and excise taxes could generate. After the income tax, the theoretical ceiling on federal revenue was the income of the entire country. The constraint was political, not structural. Together, the income tax and the Federal Reserve created the financial infrastructure of the modern American state. One gave the government unlimited revenue potential. The other gave the financial system stability and an elastic currency. And one taxed the income that flowed through the economy. The other managed the money supply that determined how much income could be generated. Both were created in 1913. Both were opposed by the same political forces for generations before they were finally enacted. Both were shaped by the same underlying conflicts between financial elites and the broader population that had been playing out since the greenback era. The people who designed the system, the participants in the Jekyll Island meeting, were not obscure figures. Their identities and their institutional affiliations were matters of public record. What was secret was the meeting itself and their role in designing the Federal Reserve. Nelson Aldrich was one of the most powerful senators in American history. His daughter had married John D. Rockefeller, Jr. President Theodore Roosevelt had called him the kingpin of the Republicans. His connections to Wall Street were not hidden. Paul Warburg was a partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, one of the most prominent investment banking houses in America. He had been born in Hamburg, Germany, and had worked for Deutsche Bank before coming to the United States. He was the most technically sophisticated banking mind among the Jekyll Island attendees and did most of the drafting. Frank Vanderlip was the president of National City Bank, which was associated with the Rockefeller financial interests. He was one of the most powerful commercial bankers in the country. Henry Davison was a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, the dominant force in American investment banking. These were not men with hidden identities or obscure agendas. They were the acknowledged leaders of the American financial establishment. What they concealed was the fact that they had designed the Federal Reserve legislation in private, at a hunting club, using first names only 3 years before it became law. Frank Vanderlip wrote in the Saturday Evening Post in 1935 that although the Aldrich Federal Reserve Plan was defeated when it bore the name Aldrich, nevertheless, its essential points were all contained in the Federal Reserve Act. He was writing about his own work. He was acknowledging, 2 decades after the fact, that the legislation that Congress debated and passed as democratic banking reform was essentially the plan that 6 men had drafted on a private island in Georgia under the cover of a duck hunting trip. The date that connects everything, February 25th, is the date on which the Secretary of State certified the 16th Amendment in 1913. It is also the date on which Congress passed the Legal Tender Act in 1862 and the National Currency Act in 1863. Whether this three-way coincidence of date across 51 years of American financial history is meaningful or accidental is a question I cannot answer. What I can tell you is that it is real. All 3 dates are in the primary historical record. The National Archives holds the certification document for the 16th Amendment. The congressional records of 1862 and 1863 contain the passage dates of the Legal Tender Act and the National Currency Act. I have checked all 3. The coincidence of February 25th connects 3 laws that together describe the arc of American monetary policy from Lincoln's emergency currency to the modern Federal Reserve System, a government that in 1862 printed its own money without banks, a government that in 1863 began rebuilding the banking system while the war was still being fought, a government that in 1913 acquired the permanent authority to tax income and the permanent institution to manage the money supply. Whether you read that arc as progress or as something else is a question I leave to you. The 1907 panic and what it revealed. There is something worth dwelling on in the image of J.P. Morgan in his private library in October of 1907, organizing the rescue of the American financial system through personal authority. Morgan was 70 years old, and he would be dead within 6 years. The men who gathered in his library understood that the stability of their system depended on one man, and that man would not live forever. The Federal Reserve in this reading was not a takeover of the financial system by its architects. It was an insurance policy, a mechanism to institutionalize the function that Morgan had performed personally, so that the system would not need another Morgan to survive the next panic. This is the interpretation that the Federal Reserve's own historians offer, and it is not without merit. The United States was the only major economic power in the world without a central bank. Financial panics in 1873, 1893, and 1907 had repeatedly destabilized the economy and caused enormous hardship for ordinary Americans. The argument for a lender of last resort was not simply a mechanism for the rich to protect themselves. It was a genuine response to a genuine problem. But the men who designed the solution were the same men who benefited from it. The governance structure they proposed gave private banking interests substantial control over the institution that would regulate them. The secrecy of the design process meant that the public and their elected representatives were presented with a plan whose origins and architects they were not told. Vanderlip's own admission tells you what you need to know about how the process was perceived by those who ran it. A man who believed in publicity for corporate affairs nonetheless found himself being as secretive and furtive as any conspirator. He knew that knowledge of who wrote the plan could influence people's perception of its value. The men who designed the Federal Reserve were not wrong that a central bank was necessary. The panic of 1907 had demonstrated the problem clearly enough. What they designed for themselves was a central bank that served that genuine public need while also serving their private interests. The two things were not incompatible, but they were also not identical. What remained? After 1913, the Federal Reserve System has been the central banking system of the United States for over a century. It has managed the money supply through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, multiple recessions, the stagflation of the 1970s, the financial crisis of 2008, and the pandemic of 2020. Its record is genuinely mixed in ways that economists continue to debate. The income tax created by the 16th Amendment has become the primary source of federal revenue. The initial rate of 1% on income above $3,000 bears no resemblance to the current system of graduated rates that applies to virtually every American with any income at all. The tool that was designed to be constitutional rather than significant became the foundation of the largest revenue system in human history. Neither the Federal Reserve nor the income tax is going anywhere. They are embedded too deeply in the structure of the American state and the American economy to be removed by anything short of a constitutional convention and a fundamental reimagining of how the federal government operates. But the story of how they came to be is worth knowing, not because it changes what they are, but because it changes how you understand them. The 16th Amendment was proposed as a political maneuver expected to fail. It was ratified by states that the Eastern establishment had assumed would block it. The Federal Reserve Act was written in secret on a private island by men who represented the largest financial institutions in the country and then presented to Congress and the public as a democratic reform. Both things happened in 1913. Both things happened in a period when the greenback movement had recently lost its final electoral battle, when the gold standard had been firmly established, and when the men who had fought to preserve the greenback were dead or aging. The people who had used government-issued currency to win a war and had fought for decades to preserve it had lost. The people who had spent those same decades building the National Currency Act system had won, and in 1913 they built the permanent institutions that would ensure the outcome. The questions that do not go away. February 25th, 1862. Legal Tender Act. Government money without banks. February 25th, 1863. National Currency Act. Banks back in the middle. February 25th, 1913. 16th Amendment certified. The permanent right to tax income established. December 23rd, 1913. Federal Reserve Act signed. The central bank created. These are dates in the historical record. They do not change. They do not require interpretation to exist. They require interpretation to understand. Senator Aldrich proposed the income tax amendment expecting it to fail. It did not fail. And the same Senator Aldrich secretly drafted the Federal Reserve legislation on a private island. That legislation in modified form became law. The two things happened in the same year. Frank Vanderlip called himself furtive. Paul Warburg drafted the discount rate policy. Nelson Aldrich's daughter had married John D. Rockefeller, Jr. These are biographical facts, not interpretations. The greenback, printed in 1862, still exists. The walnut desk still slides in perfect silence. The buildings the Carpenters Company built are still standing, and the institutions created in 1913 are still operating, still setting interest rates, still processing the income taxes that the 16th Amendment authorized. The desk was built in a world before all of this existed. The greenback was printed in a world where the outcome was still undecided. The institutions that replaced both of those worlds were designed by specific people at specific meetings whose locations and guest lists were kept secret for decades. I have only questions I cannot fully answer. Whether the Federal Reserve has served the public interest, or primarily private interest, in its century of operation. Whether the income tax, as it evolved from 1% on incomes over $3,000 to its current form, was the natural development of a necessary tool or something different. Whether the coincidence of February 25th connecting three of the most significant financial laws in American history means anything at all, I do not know. But the dates are real, and once you notice them, they do not leave you alone. The question that does not go away: was 1913 the year the modern American state was built? Or was it the year the greenbacks' defeat was made permanent and institutional? I have only questions I cannot fully answer, but the questions do not go away. And once you start asking them, you will find they never do.